Please open your Bibles to Zechariah chapter 6, please, as we continue this evening our studies in the book of Zechariah. We have pointed out that Zechariah, along with Haggai and Malachi, were prophets during the period of return from captivity. People had gone into captivity because of their sins. After 70 years, they were returning from captivity by the power of God and according to prophecy. And Zechariah is emphasizing the future glory of the people. He's using the fact that they are returning from captivity to symbolize a future even more glorious, which is fulfilled, of course, under the Messiah. So the first 6 chapters, and I've revised this chart a little bit, the first 6 chapters, 5.5 chapters, are visions in which God is symbolizing various events to come. And the last few chapters then are prophecies about Judah and her enemies. So as we look specifically at the visions that we've talked about so far, chapter 1, there was visions of horses and myrtle trees and 4 horns and craftsmen, and the significance of that was that God still intended to punish those enemies whom he had used to punish Judah for their sins. He wanted them to punish Judah, but the enemies had gone too far and they didn't do it for the right reason. So God was going to punish them, and we'll come back to that this evening as well. And then in chapter 2, there was a man with a measuring line, and God explained that he really couldn't measure because it would go beyond the walls of the city of Jerusalem because of people from other nations would come, which again is symbolic of what we're going to see with regard to the New Testament, not just specifically the Old, but it's a prophecy of the coming New Testament. Then we talked about in the next couple of chapters, first of all, Joshua the high priest, and then Zerubbabel the governor. Each of them was given symbolic significance. They were restored, Joshua to the high priesthood, and Zerubbabel was going to be successful as governor in leading the people to complete the temple. But this has significance beyond the specifics of that situation. We'll talk more about that beginning this evening in chapter 6. And then in chapter 5, we had a flying scroll and a woman in the basket, and both of these showed that sin did not belong among the people. The priesthood was symbolically being restored. The governor is being restored, and his power and position would be acceptable. But the people had to be right too. They had to remove evil because evil is what sent them into captivity in the first place. So that's where we were at the end of class last time, ready for chapter 6. We have one more vision, and then we begin to look at some other teaching, which will tie some of this together. Questions or discussion anybody has through chapter 5? All right, let's read some of chapter 6 now. Read the last vision. In chapter 6, we read verses 1 through 8. I'd like to read chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 for us, please. Bill, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, please.
Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. With the first chariot were red horses, and the second chariot black horses. With the third chariot white horses. With the fourth chariot dapple horses, strong steeds. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, What are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, These are 4 spirits of heaven, to go out from their station before the Lord of all the earth. The one with the black horse is coming to north country, the white is going after them, and the dapple are going toward the south country. Then the strong steeds went out, eager to go, that they might walk to and fro throughout the earth. And he said, Go walk to and fro throughout the earth. So they walked to and fro throughout the earth. And he called to me and spoke to me, saying, See, those who go toward the north country have given my rest to my spirit in the north country.
Okay. So we look at this final vision, and we begin in verse 1, chapter 6, and look, he turned and raised his eyes and looked, which tells us there's another vision. That's the kind of language that we know begins a vision. So here's another vision begins. And what does he see? And we're, of course, in the questions now. Question number 1, and, well, we'll go into question number 2 as well. What does he see in this vision, beginning in verse 1? Bill.
He's seen 4 chariots coming between the 2 mountains, and the mountains were of bronze.
All right, so here we see 2 mountains, bronze mountains, and 4 chariots come from between them. Let's go ahead and look at the next couple of verses. How does he describe the chariots? What does he tell us about? What more information is there about these chariots? What do we learn about the chariots? Frank?
The one was drawn with red horses, one with black horses, one with white horses, and one with dappled horses.
All right, so the difference in the chariots is the color of the horses. So I ask you to think about that, what the significance of this would be. Let's go ahead and look at question number 3 in the next couple of verses. When he asks what it means, what this was about, what was the answer given in verse 5? What does the angel explain about these chariots? What do they represent? Rick?
They were designated to walk to and fro in the earth, just like back in chapter 1, verse 8 through 9.
Right, but notice in particular, he had said not only that they were to go out according to the teachings of the Lord, but they were 4 spirits. They represent spirits of heaven who go out from before the Lord. Okay, so I ask you then to consider the significance of the color. Now, chapter 1, we had 4 horses. Well, first of all, I ask you to give some other scriptures. We talked about it. Rick brought up chapter 1, had horses of different color. What else do we have reference to horses of different color? Karen?
Revelation 6, verses 1 through 8.
All right, and some of the same colors of horses. Susie, your hand up. Oh, okay. Okay, so in chapter 1, the horses had different colors. We didn't make much a point of the different colors. I'm not sure there was a significance. They were just representing God's ability to look all around and determine what was going on. And he determined that the nations that had been mistreated, had mistreated Judah, were going to be punished. So that's what I didn't see myself. I didn't see particular significance to the colors, but here seems like, to me at least, maybe there's more significance to the color. Comments on that? Jason?
It would be an impact, like if you only saw it black and white, well, you would just think, what, but here's these vibrant colors, no doubt, that the red horses, the black horses. And when he spoke out to these people, they could picture this in their minds as to what was going on, and kind of a bit of a vision to themselves.
Okay. Other comments on the colors? So I ask you to consider the significance. Part of what makes me think that the color has symbolic significance is the fact that certain colors go in certain directions. More specific is given here. Information is given about where they go. So that just seems to me to be more significant, whereas in chapter 1, he didn't specify which went in which direction or whatever. But here we're told the different ones go in different ways. So it seems to me like there's some significance to it. So let's discuss the significance, question number 5, of other passages where the horse's color seems to matter. Okay? So let's talk about them. What about the red? What did you conclude? And I gave you some scriptures to help, but you might find some other information. What was the significance of the horses that were red? What did you think about that? Question, still in question 5. Thoughts on that, Karen?
Seems to represent death, blood.
Okay, the red representing blood, death, maybe war, dying in war. Other comments on the red? And this is basically, most of it, in my mind, comes from Revelation chapter 6, where this is described more specifically. Other comments? Okay, how about the black? Steve? Famine, okay. And maybe pestilence. Suffering, not from war, but from other circumstances. Black, death. And that some of these symbols we still use today, don't we? Sometimes red represents blood and black represents death and suffering. Okay? Other comments on the black? Again, Revelation chapter 6 especially talks about these things. The white would represent what? What did you conclude that the white represented? And again, from Revelation 6, what would the white represent? Frank?
Well, there was mentioned in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 8, white garments signifying purity and righteousness.
Okay.
And then in Revelation 19:11 and Revelation 6:1 and 2, the mention of faithful and true in righteousness, and that he judges and makes war with the bow, and wearing a crown and being conqueror.
Okay. So the book of Revelation, much of it is about the victory of God's people overcoming the forces of evil. So by faithfulness and purity, but in the end they're overcomers. They're victorious. And so the white could represent victory, overcoming, and it could also represent righteousness, the victory of righteousness over evil. Other comments on the colors and their significance? Anybody? How about the dappled? You notice all the scriptures I gave you on that one, because I didn't find any others. So what do you think the dappled would be? What are your thoughts on that? Frank?
Well, there was not very much about using the word dappled. In the English Standard Version, in Genesis 31, verses 10 and 12, there was mention of the use of the word mottled or spotted gray. Spotted gray in the New King James for that passage in Genesis.
Okay.
And, but dappled has kind of round spots that
Okay.
don't always show up very well unless the light shines on it just right.
Okay. All right, so if that's the idea, what does it represent? So you have kind of, I'd represent it as kind of a mixture. Some black and white, gray, mixture. What would it represent then? Give it your best shot. Debbie?
The pale horse in Revelation with death and Hades.
Okay, you had a pale horse, death and Hades. All right? But this one isn't exactly pale. It's colored. It's black and white, kind of mixed. Other comments? Okay, well, Karen.
Well, I wondered if it could be a mixture of the other three.
All right, or specifically of the black and the white. And that's one thing I could come up with too. It's kind of a mixture. So if the black represents plagues and suffering and maybe pestilence, and the white represents victory, then maybe the dappled is a combination of that, the suffering, pestilence that leads to victory. That's all I could get. But that's, by any means, if you have a better idea, that's fine with me. Other comments on the colors? All right, so let's see what happens to these different chariots with these different horses. Verse 5 tells us that they represent the spirits from heaven. Oh, by the way, the mountains. What were your thoughts about the mountains? That these spirits, these chariots, which represent these spirits, come from these mountains in verse 1. Anybody have any thoughts on that? What the mountains would represent? Susie?
Well, since they were sent from heaven, it made me think of bronze, I think of strength, and mountains seemingly represent strength, and so that's why.
Okay, that's what I thought too, because mountains we've seen in other places represent strength. And these are bronze or brass mountains. But verse 5 explains it. So the four spirits go out from the station before the Lord of the earth. So the mountains represent the Lord and his power. It seemed to me like the spirits, the church, go forth from God. That seems to me verse 5 is the best explanation I can come up with. This, by the way, if you haven't figured it out yet, it's not an easy vision for me to explain. But that's the best I could come up with there. Other comments through discussion through verse 5. Okay? So now where do they go? They go in different directions. And so we look at the verse 6, the black horses. Where the black horses go? Verse 6. Bill.
They were headed to the north country.
The black horses go to the north country. So I ask you the question, the north country, especially in the prophets, we've seen it many times, what's up in the north from Israel or Jerusalem? Steve?
Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia. And what that we've studied about in our study of the minor prophets is in Mesopotamia. Say it again.
Babylon.
Babylon, Assyria, they're enemies. To the northern enemies. Now, Babylon is not really technically north, it's northeast, but they had to come across to get down to Israel, so the attacks always came from the north. And so that's what we've seen in the minor prophets, that the enemies are attacked from the north. The black horse is going to go north, where those enemies were. Okay, so if the black represents, as we thought, famine, pestilence, then this suffering is going to go to the enemies who came from the north. Other comments on the black going to the north country? Frank?
You mentioned about Babylon coming from the north. Where they were to the east, they had to come up around that Fertile Crescent to come down instead of across the long distance of desert. It was too far for them to travel across there. But also the white horse followed behind the black horses.
Okay, so now we got the white horse. So the black horse, if that's pestilence and famine and so on, then that goes to Babylon, the enemies, and not just Babylon. There were other enemies that joined them in causing the suffering, but specifically Babylon. But if what would follow then, the white follows the black, so after the suffering, what would come next then? If the white followed. Debbie?
They'll be conquered.
Okay, they'd be overcome. So the result of the suffering would be defeat of the enemies. Well, where have we talked about that before in our study of the visions? Where else have we discussed that? The enemies being defeated, specifically Babylon.
4 horns and 4 craftsmen.
Okay, the 4 horns, the 4 craftsmen, and it began even with the horses among the multitude. The other horses that we talked about, God symbolically showed that these nations that deserved to be punished for what they'd done hadn't been punished yet. So the 4 horns and 4 craftsmen describe that they're going to be defeated, those enemies. We'll come back to that, it seems to me like. That's all I can make of this, is we come back to that where we began, that the enemies are going to be destroyed, specifically in verse 6. The enemy to the north would be Babylon, and those nations associated with her would suffer, and then ultimately would be overcome. They'd be defeated. Okay? Other comments on the horses going north? Bill?
In Jeremiah 1:14, it says that in the north, calamity is going to break forth in all the inhabitants of the land.
That's just one of a number of passages like that, Bill, where calamity comes from the north, meaning Babylon, specifically on Judah. It also came from the north with regard to Israel. You remember Assyria came from the north as well. They were also around that Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamia area. So it's a symbol, a number of times we've seen it. Okay, but there's also something in the south, the last part of verse 6. Where did the dappled horses go? Egypt, okay, yeah, okay. What's south from Israel and Judah? What Egypt, another enemy. And those enemies are symbolic again and again. Egypt, throughout much of the Old Testament, is symbolic of an enemy because of going all the way back to Moses and the persecution or the slavery that they brought upon Israel. So Egypt is often a symbol of an enemy. Babylon is a symbol, Assyria, and all of these. So the black and the white go north. The dappled, which is a mixture, goes south. So victory over and suffering for Egypt, if that's what it means. Okay? Other comments? Okay, Terry.
The idea of the white horse doesn't follow into the south, and there's no mention of the red horse. And the idea that I wondered about is that Egypt was never destroyed like Babylon was and Assyria was. That the conquering of that country they may have suffered, but they weren't conquered like Babylon and Assyria were.
Not like they did,
Right.
yes, and they still exist today. It's a good point. And I wonder if anybody would catch the fact that the red horse is never mentioned. Debbie?
He's called a strong steed, and he goes 2 and 4. That's all it says about the red.
Yes, it doesn't really specify it going to a particular area. Yeah, okay. So if that's true, I don't know exactly what, when he goes somewhere, he's involved, but it doesn't say where he goes. So war doesn't seem to be emphasized, at least in this vision. Okay? Other comments through verse 6? Anybody? Terry?
What is the significance of the wind? Because it talks about them going, in verse 5, they are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord.
Okay, and I think we have a translation difference there, where you said yours, English Standard says 4 winds.
In verse 5 it says, "And the angel answered and said to me, These are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth."
Okay, but the New King James says the 4 spirits. Okay, so the question is whether you're winds or spirits. The word can mean either, of course, obviously. But if it's spirits, then it would be like angels, the power of God going forth from His presence. Other comments on the winds or the spirits? Okay, like I said, for me, this wasn't an easy vision to explain, understand. Okay, other comments through verse 6? And how about verse 7 then? Or question number 7. What does he tell them to do? What do they do? In verse 7 then. Sharon.
They're sent to walk to and fro throughout the earth, and this is the 3rd time we've seen this happen. I've already mentioned chapter 1 and verse 10, the vision of horses going to and fro through the earth, but also chapter 4, verse 10, the eyes of the Lord which scan to and fro throughout the whole earth. So it seems like every few visions we have a reminder that God sees everything and knows everything and is in control. So how can they know that these visions are true, that they're going to be able to finish building this temple even though it's difficult, that the enemies are going to be punished, that these prophecies in the future are going to come true? Because God's in control. He sees everything and He knows what's going on.
And the spirits come from Him. Okay, so now, if if we're right about what these chariots, horses represent, so some went to the north, some went to the south, so if that's Babylon and Egypt and maybe nations associated with it, what would be the significance of the fact that they go throughout the earth, going to and fro? What would be the significance of that? Terry?
I think that along with what Sharon was saying, that God rules the whole earth, not just a few kingdoms within.
Okay, that's what it seemed like to me too. Yes, he was going to deal specifically with Babylon and Egypt, but other nations were evil too. And haven't we seen that in the minor prophets again and again? He talked about the various different nations. And so it's not just Babylon and Egypt. There's others as well that God intends to punish. And these plagues and so forth are going to, and defeat is going to come upon other nations around them as well. Okay? Through verse 7. Questions, comments? What's the end result, verse 8? Where does all this end up as the end of the vision, verse 8? Susie.
But that's a rest to the Lord's Spirit. That, yes, my spirit, Lord's Spirit.
Okay. Rest to the Spirit of the Lord. Why did he need rest? What was it that was keeping him from having rest? From what we've already learned, Susie. Terry.
The idea that his wrath has been pacified. He wasn't, his anger was satisfied with the result of.
Okay, all the way back to chapter 1, again, that he wasn't done with those nations till they were punished. Now they're going to be punished, and that'll satisfy his wrath. His mind can be rested easy. And of course, it's symbolic, remember again, that he's now satisfied, that he's fulfilled his responsibility to those evil nations that had harmed his people in ways that he did not approve of. All right, so if that's correct, then what we have is the plagues and punishment and so forth brought upon the enemies of God's people in fulfillment of the intent of God in the first visions that we saw. Now, obviously, I have some problems with some of the specifics, but that seems to me to be the point of the vision. Other comments on through verse 8 and this last of the visions? Okay? All right. Well, that completes our study of the visions then. But now we begin to get some discussion as we begin in chapter 6, verse 9. We have some discussion of the plan of God for the future. And in particular, this next section, beginning in verse 9, is very important, I think. I don't know if the word pivotal is proper, but almost it's very significant in bringing together all this that we've studied about. It's going to come together, and you're going to get some explanation of where all this is going. But again, there's still a lot of symbolism in it that we need to talk about. So let's go ahead and read some of it. Let's just read verse 9 through 13. We'd like to read chapter 6, verse 9 through 13 for us, please. Chapter 6, verse 9 through 13. We'd like to read that for us, please. Rick, please.
Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Receive the gift from the captives from Heldai, Tobijah, and Jediah, who have come from Babylon, and go the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and gold, make an elaborate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then speak to him, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch, from his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. So he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both.
Okay, in the last couple of verses then describe the symbolic memorial of this, but let's look at what he the Lord says to him, beginning in verse 9. First of all, verse 10, where's he supposed to go and what's he supposed to do there? Now we're in question number 10. Where's he supposed to go and what's he supposed to do? In verse 10. Frank.
He's supposed to receive the gift that come from these captives. And the same day go and enter the house of Josiah.
Okay, so we're talking about these men. Actually, 3 of them apparently brought something from Babylon that he's supposed to go get. And we'll see more about it in verse 11. And then he goes to the house of another man, Josiah, to do something with it. All right, now again, it's going to be symbolic. But these people who came back, and I don't see a whole lot of significance in these men except that they brought this from Babylon when they returned. Okay? So what do they bring with them in verse 11? And what is Zechariah supposed to do with it in verse 11? Neil.
They brought silver and gold, and Josiah apparently was supposed to fashion it into an ornate crown.
Okay, silver and gold make an elaborate crown. Zechariah was supposed to, and what did he do with the crown? What was he supposed to do with the crown? And here's where it gets significant.
Set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest.
All right. Going to make a crown of silver and gold. Going to put it on Zerubbabel, the governor? No, not Zerubbabel. He's going to put it on the high priest. Okay. Well, we'll ask the question number 12. Is that what high priests wore? Did high priests wear crowns?
Yes.
Did they? Susie?
Turbans.
Okay, the high priest wore a turban. Back in chapter 3, where they changed Joshua's garments, they put a turban on his head, not a crown, a turban. And that even goes back, even as we talked about then, back to the original appointment of Aaron's descendants to be priests. The high priest wore a turban, or a mitre, depending on your translation. But not a crown. Who wore crowns? The kings wore crowns. The high priest wore a turban. The kings wore a crown, but he's going to put a crown on the head of the high priest. Now that is so significant. By the time we're through, I hope we really get the point here that this is not what you would expect at all, and there's a reason for it. Okay, so he makes an elaborate crown of silver and gold, and he puts it on the head of Joshua. Questions, comments to verse 11? All right, Debbie.
The only king that I can remember in the Old Testament who was also a priest was the king of Salem that Abraham paid tithes to.
Who was
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. But he was not a priest in Israel, that is, in the nation of Israel, not according to the law of Moses. Because according to the law of Moses, the priests had to be who? Who could only be priests according to the law of Moses?
Sons of Aaron.
Descendants of Aaron. So which Melchizedek wasn't. But kings were supposed to be descendants of who?
Judah.
Judah, of the tribe of Judah, descendants of David, of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so that's going to become significant, but let's go ahead and read some more, and then we'll begin to make some applications of it. All right, so the crown is put on the high priest, and then there's some explanation beginning in verse 12. What is this about? Verse 12. What's it talking about? Question number 13. This is symbolic of whom? The branch. Well, we talked about the branch, haven't we? Where did we talk about the branch, and who is the branch?
Christ.
It's Jesus Christ, the Messiah, Christ. Where did we talk about him already? We already discussed the branch in book? Where was that?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3, and I think especially, what was it, verse 8? Yeah. And we talked, we did, about other passages that use that expression, the branch. So it says, his name is the branch, verse 12. From his place he shall branch out. Okay, it's the significance of the branch was what then? Jesus, or the Christ. But in what sense does the word branch fit Christ? He's a branch from, Susie?
Well, it's from the root of Jesse.
From the root of Jesse and David. Right? He's a descendant of David, like the promise that was made to David. So he's called the branch, and sometimes the root and other expressions. But the point is, this is the Messiah. Here you have a very powerful and important prophecy of Christ, the Messiah. Okay? And what you're going to do, all right? His branch is going to, so this isn't really about Joshua. Joshua is the symbol, but it's really talking about somebody else, the Messiah. What's the Christ, the Messiah, going to do? In the last part of verse 12, and especially in verse 13, what's he going to do? Steve?
Rebuild the temple.
Going to build the temple, and then what? Rick?
He'll sit on his throne.
Build the temple, sit on his throne, and what you going to do on the throne? Rule. Rule. Okay? Now the temple, that fits the high priest part, but the ruling on the throne, that's a king. Okay? So you got the high priest, but you got the king, both. Temple, but ruling on the throne. So the last part of the verse says he'll be what? What will he be? A priest on his throne. And the council of peace shall be between them both. All right, so what we've got here then is a prophecy, the man whose name is the branch. He will build the temple of the Lord. He will rule on his throne, be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between them. Okay. So I ask you the questions then. We know it's the question number 16. We already discussed it. How does this relate to, what does it tell us about the law of Moses? How does this relate to the law of Moses? This symbolism then. What are the consequences of this? Discussion? Terry?
Well, it means there has to be a change in the law.
Number one, the law has to change. Because the old law, the law of Moses, would not allow a priest of the tribe of Judah, but the kings had to be the tribe of Judah. Okay? The only way it's going to happen is if the law changes. Okay? Susie?
Not be a physical king, but a spiritual king.
Why?
Because a physical king would be, would make physical sacrifices, and he did make a physical, because of the change of the law.
Okay. And we go back to the book of Jeremiah, which we didn't discuss, but we talked about. Through Jeremiah, God prophesied that the line of David through the kings in Judah could no longer rule on earth in Jerusalem. That was not going to be allowed anymore. So this king that we're talking about, who is also a high priest, the law wouldn't allow that. There had to be a change in the law. Going to be a descendant of David, going to be a high priest, but not a descendant of Aaron, according to the tribe of Levi. Okay? A priest on his throne. Okay? Other comments? Susie?
Back up in verse 13, where it says, he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory. In Isaiah 22, verse 24, there again speaking of the Messiah, they will hang on him all the glory of his father's house. I thought that was an important phrase.
Okay. All right, so question number 17, we've already talked about this somewhat, how this differs from the law of Moses. Any other comments on those other passages in question number 17? Terry?
Well, we are told that he will be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was the king of Salem, like Debbie was saying, but he was also high priest.
Okay, so a lot of this ends up being explained in the book of Hebrews. Let's go ahead and read that passage in Psalm 110, then we'll close with it, because it's pertinent to what we're discussing. Look at Psalm 110, and we'll look at the first 4 verses, and then we'll close with that. Psalm 110, first 4 verses. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Psalm 110, verses 1 through 4. Bill, please. Psalm 110, verses 1 through 4.
The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power, in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. You have a dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.
All right. So here is a prophecy of one who would rule, verse 2, in the midst of his enemies, the day of his power. But he's a priest ruling after the order of Melchizedek. And Debbie discussed that about Melchizedek. We'll talk more about that next time and tie it together. So I want you to, in your assignment for next time then, I want you to be looking at the assignments and the specific questions or passages about Jesus or the Christ as a king. What sense is he a king? How does this all fit together, priest and king, on the New Testament? And what are the consequences and significance for us today? Okay? Anything else before we close? Okay.